Hey guys, tonight we begin with work. Endless work. The kind of work that starts before sunrise, ends after dark, and still somehow leaves people saying things like, well, at least tomorrow might be slightly less terrible, which it usually was not. So dim the lights, settle into your blankets, appreciate your modern chair, your climate control, your ability to order food without personally harvesting wheat for 6 straight months, because tonight we drift slowly into the brutal daily work routines of ordinary people in history. The peasants, the servants, the laborers, the exhausted souls who woke every morning already physically disappointed by the existence of morning. And the strange thing is, most of them simply accepted this as normal, because if everyone around you are also carrying buckets through freezing mud before dawn, you do not really stop and question the system. You just continue walking, slowly, probably with back pain. Now let us wander gently into a medieval village. Early morning, very early. The kind of early where the sky still looks undecided about becoming daytime. Mist hangs low over fields. Chickens are already emotionally committed to screaming at the universe. Somewhere a cow makes a noise suggesting deep personal dissatisfaction. And inside a small wooden house with smoke-darkened beams, a peasant family begins waking up. Not because they want to, because survival has scheduled another appointment. The father rises first. Of course he does. History loved giving men jobs involving repetitive lifting and permanent joint damage. He pulls himself from rough bedding slowly. His body already hurts. Not dramatically, not in a cinematic way, just the steady dull ache of someone who has spent 20 years treating heavy objects as close personal companions. Nearby, his wife is already awake too, because medieval women essentially worked 2 jobs simultaneously for their entire lives, while history somehow continued, describing men as the workers, a fascinating level of confidence. From medieval chroniclers, she stirs embers back to life in the hearth, carefully. Fire matters enormously. Without it, breakfast becomes extremely theoretical. She prepares coarse bread, maybe porridge if grain supplies cooperate, perhaps weak ale, because water quality throughout much of history was often engaged in a long-term campaign against humanity. The children wake next, not leisurely, no stretching peacefully beneath soft blankets while sunlight filters gently through curtains. Medieval childhood involved immediate participation in labor the moment your limbs became moderately functional. A 7-year-old might already carry water, feed animals, gather wood, scare birds from fields, using techniques based mostly on yelling enthusiastically. And honestly, children were useful for small jobs, because adults were too busy surviving larger ones. Now let us step outside. The village slowly comes alive. Thin smoke rises from rooftops. He stretches beneath heavy blankets, while servants prepare clothing complicated enough to resemble architectural projects. A basin of water appears for washing. Breakfast appears. Candles burn softly. Somewhere downstairs, 6 exhausted people have already been awake for 3 hours, ensuring this man can experience a pleasant morning. Civilization has always depended heavily on invisible labor. Now let us float back outside toward craftsmen, because skilled labor existed too. A blacksmith begins work early. His workshop smells of coal smoke and hot metal. Sparks rise through dim air, while hammer strikes echo rhythmically across the village. The work is brutal. Arms strain constantly. Heat presses against skin relentlessly. Yet blacksmiths often held respected positions, because without tools, nothing functions. A carpenter nearby shapes wood carefully, with hand tools, requiring endless patience. Every board uneven, every measurement personal. No machines, no power tools, just skill, effort, and the quiet understanding that mistakes cause time nobody possesses. And let us pause gently on time itself, because medieval people worked according to sunlight and seasons, rather than clocks. In summer, workdays stretched endlessly. Dawn arrived early, darkness arrived late, which meant labor continued for astonishing lengths of time. Harvest season especially became nearly overwhelming. Everyone worked, everyone, children, elderly relatives, women carrying infants, entire communities moving together through fields trying desperately to gather crops before weather destroyed everything. Rain approaching during harvest could produce village-wide despair faster than almost any political event. Now imagine carrying grain manually for hours beneath summer heat. No modern hydration packs, no comfortable shoes, no motivational podcasts explaining how this suffering is secretly building character. Just sun, dust, sweat, and a growing suspicion that your spine may someday simply resign from service entirely. Yet people adapted. That is the strange part. Humans normalize almost anything given enough repetition. Now let us drift briefly toward medieval laundresses, possibly among the most underappreciated, exhausted people in history. Washing clothing by hand involved hauling water, scrubbing fabric aggressively, boiling garments, wringing them dry, then repeating this endlessly while standing outdoors in cold weather, because medieval society remained deeply committed to making basic survival unnecessarily difficult. Imagine winter washing, hands submerged in freezing water while wind cuts across open fields, so harsh enough to insult human skin personally, heavy wet fabric refusing cooperation, and afterward, more laundry tomorrow, always more laundry. Now let us wander toward roads, because travel itself often became labor. A messenger walks mile after mile carrying letters between castles. Boots wear thin, rain arrives exactly when least convenient. Roads transform into mud rivers with remarkable speed. Inns provide questionable rest involving shared beds and suspicious smells. Yet the messenger continues, because somebody important somewhere wants a letter delivered immediately regarding land disputes or marriage negotiations, or whether Lord somebody insulted another urban noble during dinner 3 weeks ago. History contains enormous amounts of walking connected to deeply unnecessary arguments. Now let us gently enter a monastery. Monks work too. People often imagine monks floating peacefully through candlelit corridors, thinking philosophical thoughts, while birds sing softly outside stained glass windows. Reality involved farming, gardening, copying manuscripts, until your fingers stopped cooperating properly, brewing beer, cleaning, repairing buildings, praying at inconvenient hours. A monk bends over a manuscript table for hours copying text letter by letter. Candlelight strains his eyes, ink stains his hands permanently. His back curls slowly forward like a tree surviving strong winds, and still he continues carefully, because books are precious objects and mistakes require frustrating correction. Some monks worked fields directly alongside peasants. Others maintained libraries. Others managed supplies. Even spiritual life involved administrative exhaustion, which feels extremely believable somehow. Now let us float toward medieval cities. Craft workers crowd narrow streets. Butchers prepare meat, while trying not to think too deeply about smells. Tanners process leather in conditions so foul entire neighborhoods avoided them emotionally and physically. Fishmongers shout prices, while cats observe nearby with criminal intentions. Noise fills the streets constantly. Hammering, animals, arguments, carts rattling over stone. And through all this movement, workers continue endlessly, because stopping means losing money, food, stability, survival itself. A baker rises before dawn every day, every single day. Imagine never sleeping late for 40 years, because bread refuses flexibility. Now let us drift gently into royal labor, because kings technically work too, though differently. A medieval king spends hours hearing petitions, reviewing taxes, negotiating alliances, attending ceremonies, receiving nobles, listening to complaints, pretending to enjoy diplomatic conversations, and occasionally leading military campaigns, because apparently ruling peacefully for 5 minutes was considered historically suspicious. Some rulers enjoyed work excessively. Others avoided it professionally. One king might spend all day hunting, while advisors quietly handled governance, behind curtains, like exhausted babysitters, managing an overconfident child. Other becomes obsessed with paperwork and reads reports late into the night, while everyone around him regrets introducing literacy to royalty. Human personality shapes history more than people like admitting. Now let us settle beside an older peasant woman near evening. She spins wool beside fading firelight. Her fingers move automatically from decades of repetition. Outside, darkness spreads slowly across fields. She has worked since childhood, her entire life measured by labor, planting, harvesting, cooking, cleaning, mending, repeating, and yet there are small moments too. A shared joke, warm soup, children laughing briefly before sleep, a dog resting near the hearth. History was difficult, but it was still life. Not endless misery every second. Humans always create little pockets of comfort between disasters. Now evening deepens. Workers return home slowly, boots muddy, hands aching, bodies heavy with exhaustion. Inside cottages, fires glow softly. Bread tears apart between rough hands. Ale pours into simple cups. People talk quietly about weather, animals, neighbors, tools needing repair. Tomorrow waits patiently outside. Another full day already approaching. And everyone knows it. A servant curls beside warm kitchen stones for sleep. A farmer lowers himself carefully onto straw bedding. A blacksmith washes soot from his arms with limited success. A monk extinguishes candles beside unfinished manuscripts. A laundress finally rests hands cracked raw from winter water. And across the medieval world, millions of exhausted people close their eyes, knowing morning will ask everything from them again. Now take a slow breath. Let the image settle. The fields, the kitchens, the workshops, the endless carrying, lifting, walking, scrubbing, repairing, cooking, tending, building, surviving. Not glamorous work, not remembered individually, but the kind of labor that quietly held entire civilizations together, while kings collected portraits and historians wrote down the names of men who never carried their own buckets. Hey guys, tonight we begin with a deeply uncomfortable historical reality. Not dragons. Not kings dramatically pointing at maps, while everyone pretends the plan makes sense. Not even plague doctors wandering around, looking like confused leather birds. No, tonight we begin with ownership, human ownership, which, historically speaking, humanity committed to with truly exhausting enthusiasm. So dim the lights, settle into your blankets. Maybe appreciate, for one peaceful moment, The fact that no medieval landlord currently owns your entire existence along with your goat, your future children, and possibly your left shoe, a comforting modern luxury. Because tonight, we drift slowly into the quiet, strange, deeply unequal world of living like property. And the strange thing is, for enormous stretches of history, millions of people simply accepted this as normal, not pleasant, not fair, but normal in the same way rain is normal, or taxes, or stepping on something mysterious in the kitchen at night, and deciding emotionally not to investigate further. Now, when modern people imagine slavery or servitude, the mind often jumps immediately toward chains, markets, dramatic speeches, and cinematic suffering beneath storm clouds. And yes, history absolutely contained horrors, many of them. Humanity has always been remarkably creative when inventing ways to mistreat other humans, but much of daily life inside systems of ownership felt quieter than that, which somehow makes it stranger, because most days were ordinary. That is the unsettling part. People woke up, worked, ate bread, complained about weather, fell asleep exhausted, raised children, argued with neighbors, got sick, grew old, all while legally belonging to someone else. So let us wander slowly into ancient Rome. Of course we begin in Rome. Rome appears in history the way overly confident people appear in group projects, everywhere, constantly involved. Somehow both impressive and deeply exhausting. The city wakes early, very early. The streets already smell faintly of smoke, animals, sewage, baking bread, and ambition. Roman ambition had a smell, probably. Slightly expensive olive oil, mixed with political anxiety. And moving quietly through one wealthy household is a servant girl, young, maybe 14, maybe younger. History was often deeply casual about childhood, in ways modern people find alarming. She rises before sunrise, because wealthy Romans enjoyed comfort, and comfort required other humans losing sleep first. She moves carefully through dim corridors carrying water, not because she particularly wants to, because she must. That distinction shapes everything. Now here is something quietly strange about slavery in many ancient societies. Enslaved people were everywhere, cooking meals, teaching children, managing finances, cleaning villas, working mines, rowing ships, copying books, farming land. Some lived brutal short lives in horrific labor conditions, especially miners, galley workers, and agricultural laborers forced into endless physical exhaustion beneath heat that felt personally insulting. Others occupied strange in-between positions inside elite households, trusted but owned, close but never equal. A Roman aristocrat might trust an enslaved secretary with private political information, while still legally treating him somewhere between a servant and a piece of decorative furniture. Civilization truly contained some emotionally confusing contradictions. Now imagine the household slowly waking. The master complains immediately. Of course he does. Important men in history often begin mornings by being dissatisfied with something extremely minor. The water temperature, the bread texture, the emotional tone of curtains. Human greatness has always rested on surprisingly fragile foundations. Nearby, enslaved workers move carefully around him. One adjusts clothing, another prepares breakfast, someone else organizes scrolls. A child servant waits silently near the doorway holding sandals, and all of this unfolds with practiced calm, because survival inside unequal systems often depends on reading moods quickly, very quickly. An enslaved worker in ancient Rome learned expressions the way sailors learned weather. A sigh meant one thing, a raised voice meant another. Silence could mean almost anything, and yet daily life continued. Now let us drift gently toward the countryside. Because large estates swallowed enormous numbers of people, Roman farms, especially wealthy ones, relied heavily on enslaved labor. Fields stretched outward beneath burning sunlight, while workers harvested grain, olives, grapes. The work never really ended. Agricultural labor, in the ancient world, had a deeply repetitive quality. Plant, carry, lift, cut, repeat, until your body develops a complicated emotional relationship with pain. And somewhere overseeing everything stands the estate manager, usually unpleasant. History consistently promotes unpleasant men into supervisory roles with remarkable confidence. He carries records, counts supplies, counts workers, counts productivity. Because once humans create economic systems, they immediately begin turning suffering into paperwork. Now let us pause briefly on sleeping arrangements. Because they were rarely comfortable, enslaved laborers often slept in cramped shared quarters, simple rooms, straw bedding, little privacy, bodies packed close together after endless labor, snoring everywhere. Someone coughing constantly, someone talking in sleep, someone staring quietly into darkness, wondering if tomorrow will feel any different from today. Spoiler, probably not. Now let us float gently across centuries, because ownership change forms constantly. Ancient Greece, Rome, medieval serfdom, Ottoman households, colonial plantations, imperial courts, different systems, different laws, same uncomfortable pattern. One group possessing power so completely that another group's life barely belonged to themselves anymore. Now here is where medieval Europe becomes strangely complicated, because serfs were not technically slaves in many places. Technically, history loves technicalities. A serf could not usually be bought individually like Roman slaves. Very progressive. Gold star from medieval Europe. Instead, they belonged to land obligations, which means if land changed owners, congratulations, so did the people attached to it. An emotionally difficult real estate feature. Imagine living in a tiny village in 1300s Europe. You wake before dawn because medieval agriculture treats sleep as a suspicious activity. Your cottage is small, your floor is dirt, your chicken has entered the house again, and now behaves like a tax collector. Outside, fog hangs low over fields, and today, like most days, your labor does not fully belong to you. Some portion belongs to the local lord. You owe grain, you owe labor, you owe taxes, you owe fees for using ovens, mills, forests, roads, bridges, and probably oxygen, if the nobility could legally organize it. And yet life continues in strangely ordinary rhythms. You still marry, still gossip, still celebrate festivals, still complain about weather with ancient commitment. Human beings adapt frighteningly well to unfair systems once those systems become ordinary. Now let us gently meet a medieval lord, not especially evil. History rarely functions through cartoon villains twirling mustaches beside fireplaces. Usually systems survive because ordinary people participate in them casually. This lord wakes in relative comfort. A servant helps him dress because powerful people throughout history seem deeply determined never to put on their own socks. He eats warm bread, drinks ale, reviews estate matters, and somewhere in those records are human lives reduced into obligations, families listed beside grain totals, labor days calculated neatly, because distance from suffering makes inequality feel administrative. A timeless human talent. Now drift with me toward another world entirely. An Ottoman palace, quiet corridors, patterned carpets, golden lamps flickering softly. Servants move silently through enormous rooms, designed to make rulers feel emotionally important at all times. And among these workers are enslaved people occupying deeply complicated positions, some highly educated, some politically influential, some trapped inside systems that rewarded obedience with privilege while never fully allowing freedom. One young servant studies languages, another manages correspondence. A palace musician tunes an instrument softly before evening entertainment. The empire functions partly through people who legally remain property, while simultaneously becoming essential to the machinery of power. History rarely organizes itself neatly. Now here is something softly unsettling. Children born into slavery often inherited status automatically. Imagine discovering your life's direction before you can even speak properly. Not through personality, not through dreams, not through talent, through ownership paperwork. A profoundly depressing administrative process, and yet parents still loved children fiercely. That matters. Even inside terrible systems, ordinary affection survived stubbornly. A mother still soothed nightmares, still shared food, still whispered stories before sleep. History is never entirely cruelty or entirely kindness. Usually both exist together awkwardly in the same room. Now let us float gently toward domestic service in aristocratic households. A strange middle ground, because proximity to luxury does not equal participation in it. A servant girl in an enormous French estate during the 1700s might spend hours brushing silk gowns she will never wear, lighting fireplaces in rooms she will never relax inside, preparing elaborate desserts she will never taste properly. Imagine carrying silver trays through candlelit halls while aristocrats discuss philosophy and human freedom directly beside you without noticing the irony at all. An astonishing level of social confidence. And of course many elites convinced themselves the system was natural. People always do. Every era invents comforting explanations for inequality. The gods approve. Nature intended it. Society requires it. Tradition demands it. The economy depends on it. History rotates excuses the way noble households rotated servants. Now let us gently wander into nighttime again, because exhaustion defines these lives. A field laborer collapses onto straw bedding after 14 hours of work, hands blistered, back aching, too tired even for conversation. Nearby, another worker quietly mends torn clothing by firelight, because tomorrow requires the same clothes again, always again. And somewhere beyond the fields, in brightly lit halls, wealthy people complain that musicians played slightly too loudly during dinner. Human experiences vary wildly depending on which side of power you occupy. Now let us drift toward colonial America. Plantations stretching outward beneath humid skies. Large houses standing proudly, while enormous suffering operates beneath every polished surface. Enslaved workers rise before dawn. Again, always before dawn. Cooking, harvesting, carrying, building, cleaning. The labor system consumes entire lives steadily and without emotional reflection. And here is something important. Even in brutal systems, people created culture, music, stories, religious traditions, humor, resistance, tiny private moments of humanity that ownership could never fully erase. An exhausted worker might still laugh quietly at night, still fall in love, still dream, still hope for children to survive. Powerful systems can control bodies frighteningly well. Souls become more complicated. Now let us pause beside one older servant, a man who has spent 40 years inside the same household. He knows every hallway, every family argument, every seasonal routine. He remembers children growing up, remembers former masters dying, remembers furniture older than some aristocrats currently using it, and yet legally, he still owns almost nothing. Not the house, not the land, not fully even his own time. There is something deeply strange about spending decades inside a place without truly belonging there. Now let us drift softly toward emotional survival, because people inside oppressive systems developed coping mechanisms constantly. Humor mattered enormously. Small acts of resistance mattered. Private friendships, songs sung quietly during labor, nicknames for unpleasant supervisors. History strongly suggests workers across all centuries enjoyed mocking authority whenever possible, a deeply comforting human constant. Now imagine several servants late at night, after nobles finally sleep. The kitchen grows quieter, fire embers glow low. Someone steals leftover bread carefully. Someone complains softly about the master's personality. Someone imitates an aristocratic voice dramatically enough to make another servant nearly choke, trying not to laugh. Tiny moments, tiny freedoms, tiny rebellions against systems, too large to confront openly. Now let us float gently toward another uncomfortable truth. Many people living inside these systems could not imagine alternatives, not because they lacked intelligence, because systems shape imagination. If everyone around you accepts hierarchy from birth, questioning it becomes difficult, not impossible, but difficult. A medieval peasant might genuinely believe nobles exist because God arranged society carefully like shelves. An enslaved Roman might accept ownership of inevitable because Rome itself depends upon it. Humans normalize environments very quickly, even unfair ones, especially unfair ones. Now evening settles again. A servant extinguishes candles, one by one, in a noble household. A field worker rubs aching shoulders beside fading firelight. A palace attendant folds embroidered robes worth more money than entire villages will ever see. And somewhere, a child falls asleep already belonging to someone else legally before fully understanding what that means. History can feel very heavy sometimes, quietly heavy, not through battles, not through dramatic speeches, through ordinary routines, repeated endlessly across generations. Now take a slow breath. Let the images settle softly. The candlelight, the fields, the kitchens, the crowded sleeping quarters, the long exhausting workdays, the strange reality of living inside systems where your labor, your movement, and sometimes your very existence belonged partly to someone else. And yet people still laughed, still loved, still rested beside fires, still woke every morning and continued living somehow, because humans are painfully adaptable creatures, even when history gives them far less freedom than they deserve. Hey guys, tonight we begin somewhere tense, not loud exactly. History is rarely loud in the way movies pretend it was. Most fear arrives quietly, a glance from the wrong official, a knock at the door after dark, a ruler suddenly deciding that making an example of someone sounds emotionally satisfying before lunch. So dim the lights, pull the blanket a little closer. Appreciate, for one calm modern moment, the comforting reality that your local baker probably cannot legally throw you into a dungeon because you offended his cousin during a goat-related disagreement 3 years ago. A reassuring feature of modern civilization, because tonight we drift slowly into the long, uneasy world of punishments and fear. The systems people created to control each other. The punishments designed not merely to hurt, but to warn. To remind entire populations that authority existed, was watching, and occasionally woke up in deeply unpleasant moods. And the strange thing is, most people living inside these systems still carried on normally. They baked bread, raised children, argued about money, complained about weather, fell asleep tired beside fires, while somewhere nearby a public punishment reminded everyone to remain obedient. Human beings are remarkably adaptable creatures, emotionally concerningly adaptable. Now, let us wander gently into a medieval town. Morning arrives slowly. Mist hangs over crooked rooftops. Chickens move importantly through muddy streets, as though they personally supervise civilization. A blacksmith begins hammering metal somewhere nearby. The smell of smoke drifts through narrow lanes, and in the center of town, a wooden structure waits quietly. The stocks, of course the stocks. History absolutely loved public embarrassment. Not every punishment involved executions or dungeons. In fact, many punishments aimed more toward humiliation, which honestly says a great deal about humanity. Physical pain fades. Public embarrassment lingers forever emotionally. Now imagine a baker standing trapped in wooden stocks because he cheated customers on bread weight. People pass slowly. Some laugh, some insult him. Children throw things, because children across all centuries contain small traces of chaos, and the baker stands there exhausted, humiliated, deeply regretting his creative relationship with flour measurements. Now here is something quietly important. Punishments in history were often theatrical. Authority wanted visibility. A punishment hidden away inside private rooms teaches very little to the crowd. But a punishment displayed publicly, that becomes a lesson, a performance. A civic event with deeply uncomfortable educational goals, which means medieval towns occasionally treated suffering with the same energy people reserve for street festivals. Humanity truly contains some unfortunate instincts. Now let us drift toward ancient Rome, because Rome punished people with enormous confidence. A Roman magistrate sits in public, wearing expensive fabric, and an expression suggesting he enjoys rules emotionally. Before him stands a frightened man, accused of theft. Nearby, citizens gather watching quietly. Punishment in Rome depended heavily on status, very heavily. A wealthy Roman citizen might receive exile. An enslaved person accused of the same crime would receive brutal physical punishment, because equality before law was not exactly Rome's favorite concept. Roman society loved hierarchy with exhausting dedication. Now imagine the emotional pressure of living inside such a world. One wrong accusation, one unpaid debt, one politically inconvenient opinion overheard during dinner, and suddenly authority notices you. Not ideal, especially because ancient legal systems often functioned with a level of flexibility that lawyers would describe as emotionally alarming. Evidence sometimes mattered. Connections mattered more. Now let us gently move into a castle. Stone walls rising above cold hills. Guards watching from towers, trying very hard to appear intimidating despite probably being cold constantly. Inside the castle sits a lord, not necessarily cruel by medieval standards, which is already a sentence containing deeply low expectations. He reviews disputes from nearby villages, a stolen pig, an unpaid tax, a fight over land boundaries involving two brothers who now dramatically refuse to acknowledge each other's existence despite living 20 feet apart, and because authority in medieval society rested heavily on maintaining order, punishments followed quickly: fines, whippings, time in small cells, public shaming. The exact punishment mattered less than the reminder underneath it: obey. Now here is something softly exhausting about historical fear. It was constant, not panic every day, not dramatic screaming, just steady awareness. The awareness that power existed above you and could interrupt your life whenever it wished. A peasant feared taxes, a servant feared dismissal, a merchant feared accusations, a noble feared rivals. Even kings feared other kings, ambitious relatives, poison, rebellion, prophecy, bad harvests, and occasionally astrology. Especially astrology. History contains a truly astonishing number of powerful men making important decisions, because stars appeared emotionally concerning. Now let us float gently toward religious fear, because medieval Europe absolutely committed itself to spiritual anxiety. A small church stands beneath grey skies. Candles flicker softly inside. A priest speaks about sin, punishment, hellfire, judgment, and ordinary villagers listen carefully, because religion was not merely belief, it was structure, explanation, fear management. The medieval afterlife contained deeply specific unpleasant possibilities: demons, torment, endless suffering, all described with remarkable confidence by people who had obviously never visited personally. Now imagine lying awake at night in a small cottage, hearing sermons about eternal punishment all afternoon. The fire burns low, wind moves outside, and somewhere in the darkness, your brain quietly wonders whether forgetting prayers twice this week result in infinite suffering forever. A stressful spiritual system. Now let us gently wander into royal courts, because fear becomes stranger near power. A courtier in Renaissance France bows carefully before the king, very carefully. Too little respect appears insulting. Too much appears suspicious. Court life often resembled emotional tightrope walking performed by people wearing expensive shoes and severe anxiety. One careless comment could destroy careers. One rumor could remove favor permanently. One awkward political alliance, and suddenly you are reassigned to a distant estate, where even the sheep seem judgmental. And kings themselves often encourage this uncertainty intentionally. Fear stabilizes authority remarkably well. If everyone feels slightly nervous around you, congratulations, you are historically powerful. Now drift with me toward a servant girl working in a noble household. She spills wine accidentally during dinner. Silence follows immediately. A terrifying silence, because small mistakes carried enormous emotional weight in hierarchical societies. The noblewoman stares. The servant apologizes quickly, very quickly, and now the entire room waits to discover what mood authority currently occupies. Punishment, forgiveness, public humiliation, an exhausted lecture about carelessness delivered by someone who has never carried anything heavier than jewelry. Eventually the servant receives only sharp words. Relief floods through her instantly. That is another strange thing about fear. Once people expect harsh consequences, even mild mercy feels enormous. Now let us float toward schools. Yes, schools. Because historical education often involved alarming enthusiasm for a physical punishment. A classroom in the 1600s smells faintly of ink, wood smoke, damp clothing, and educational despair. Children sit quietly at rough desks. The teacher carries a stick. Of course he does. History rarely trusted children enough to educate them without intimidation. One boy struggles with Latin grammar. Unfortunately for him, Latin grammar already feels like punishment naturally. Additional punishment seems unnecessary. Yet here we are. The teacher strikes desks dramatically, while students attempt memorization through pure survival instinct. And honestly, some educational philosophies remained emotionally committed to misery for centuries. Now here is something important. Fear worked because life itself already felt unstable. Harvest failures happened. Disease appeared suddenly. Winter arrived aggressively. Most ordinary people possessed very little protection against disaster, which meant authority became even harder to challenge. When survival already requires enormous effort, rebellion feels risky. Now let us gently wander into nighttime. A prisoner sits inside a small medieval cell, not cinematic dungeon darkness with dramatic chains everywhere. History usually looked less organized than movies prefer. The room is cold, straw scattered unevenly across stone, water dripping somewhere with exhausting consistency, and the prisoner waits. Waiting was one of history's favorite punishments. Waiting for judgment. Waiting for release, waiting for someone important to remember your existence. Now imagine the emotional weight of uncertainty in societies without reliable legal protections, no guaranteed trial timeline, no appeals process, no reassuring paperwork, just authority moving at whatever speed authority preferred, usually slowly. Now let us drift toward another form of fear entirely. Fear inside families, because historical households often revolved around strict authority structures too. A father's word carried enormous power. A husband's authority often remained legally protected. Children obeyed adults automatically, because questioning authority historically produced very poor outcomes for smaller humans. Imagine a young noble boy studying beneath harsh tutors, while his father criticizes every weakness relentlessly, because aristocratic families treated emotional warmth as suspiciously unnecessary. Or a royal child raised beneath constant pressure to marry correctly, behave correctly, inherit correctly, breathe correctly. Privilege and fear often slept in the same bed historically, sometimes literally. Now let us float gently toward witchcraft accusations. Of course, eventually we arrive here. Few things combine fear and confusion more effectively than societies deciding invisible magical conspiracies explain bad weather. A village gathers anxiously after crops fail. Someone becomes suspicious, a lonely widow, an herbal healer, a socially awkward neighbor who owns too many cats and accidentally made eye contact during lightning once. Suddenly fear begins spreading socially. And fear spreads very quickly when communities lack explanations for suffering. Now here is the sad part. Most witch trials reveal ordinary human patterns. Personal grudges, property disputes, religious panic, loneliness, the terrifying speed at which groups convince themselves that punishing someone will restore order somehow. History repeatedly demonstrates that frightened humans make terrible investigators. Now let us gently slow the pace. A watchman walks through sleeping streets carrying a lantern. Footsteps echo softly. Somewhere a dog barks. A window closes quietly. Most people inside these towns simply want ordinary safety. Warm food. Peaceful sleep. No attention from officials. That was often the dream. Not glory, not power, just invisibility. Because invisibility protected ordinary people remarkably well in harsh societies. Now drift with me toward Imperial China, an enormous bureaucracy, humming quietly beneath dynasties. Officials carrying records, laws carefully documented, punishments precisely categorized, and yet fear remained everywhere here too. Fear of dishonoring family, fear of failing imperial examinations after studying 4 years, fear of disappointing superiors, fear of public disgrace. Social pressure becomes extremely powerful when entire cultures organize around reputation and hierarchy. Now imagine a scholar sitting late at night copying texts endlessly by candlelight, because failure means losing opportunity, only for himself, but for generations of family expectation. No pressure, just your entire bloodline, emotionally invested in your handwriting. Now let us return gently towards Europe again. A nobleman wakes suddenly during the night. He heard something, perhaps nothing, but nobles throughout history developed extremely nervous sleeping habits, because political systems built on inheritance encourage relatives to become surprisingly ambitious. Servants check corridors, guards reassure him, candles relight, and eventually everyone settles again into an easy sleep. Power attracts fear the way kitchens attract cats, constantly. Now here is another strange truth. Punishments often reflected society's deepest anxieties. A society fearing disorder creates harsh discipline. A society fearing heresy creates religious punishments. A society fearing rebellion creates public executions. Fear shapes law constantly. Even modern societies do this. We just use more paperwork and fewer town squares. Now evening settles softly again. A peasant bars his cottage door. A servant whispers apologies after minor mistakes. A prisoner stares into darkness. A monk prays anxiously about sign. A king sleeps badly surrounded by guards. And across history, millions of ordinary people move carefully through systems designed to remind them constantly where power lived, not always through violence, often through uncertainty, which can feel even heavier sometimes. Now take a slow breath. Let the images settle softly. The castle walls, the candlelit courts, the prison cells, the village sermons, the quiet nervousness inside ordinary lives shaped by punishments and fear. And remember, most people in history were not heroes. They were simply tired humans, trying very carefully not to attract the wrong attention from powerful people, having emotionally unpredictable days. A deeply understandable survival strategy.